Go ahead and get started. My name is Bonnie. I'm a talent branding co-op here at Acquia. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here with us. Just to give everyone a quick rundown of our agenda, we're going to start off with Kerry Key, our VP of Product Engineering. He's going to talk a bit about our engineering culture here at Acquia, and then our Chief Software Architect, Ed Brennan, will get right into our tech talk, Modernizing Microservices with Kubernetes and Containerization, which will be followed by our open conversation. We will be using the chat function to submit questions during the talk, but we do ask that you try to hold them until the open discussion if possible. And if we don't get to all of them today, we will be following up with you via email afterwards. If after the talk ends, you'd like to learn a bit more about Acquia, please feel free to visit our career page at acquia.com/careers. We have openings in Boston, which are, of course, currently remote at senior, principal, and tech lead levels, as well as a principal software architect opening. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kerry, and we can get started.
Great. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. All right. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for attending our Tech Talk. My name is Kerry Key. I am the VP of Engineering for the platform organization within Acquia Engineering. I'm a relatively new addition to the team. I joined in early June. I'm very excited to talk about the transformation and the cultural changes that we're undergoing right now here at Acquia. The title of this talk is Modernization with Microservices and Containers. At a larger level or a conceptual level, this is a really significant replatforming that the company is undergoing, and specifically in engineering. And this also includes a pretty significant technology elevation. This transformation is really coming about for a number of reasons, but the most obvious ones for us is that we've undergone a lot of growth over the last few years. Much of it was through our own organic growth with our business, but also stemming from a few significant acquisitions that we made, particularly in 2019. As a result of that, in order for us to really pull off what I consider a pretty significant transformation, it really requires a pretty progressive architectural vision, but it also requires what I would consider a unifying culture. And so even though we are certainly going to get into a lot of the technical details of the architecture and what we're doing in the nuts and bolts, there's a very important cultural component to what we're doing as well, because as this company has undergone a lot of change and growth, you really want to make sure that all the resources are set up for success. And the cultural aspect is a very important part of that. I'm going to switch on to my first slide here and get right into it. So this slide is, the deck that I'm showing you is just an excerpt of a larger cultural deck that we have in engineering that's used primarily for onboarding. But, what you're going to see here is a lot of things that, in my view, they're kind of common sense things by themselves, but together they really encapsulate a very powerful story, which is the way we sort of package this up. And that, we really want people to understand our culture. We want to be able to execute on it. And so this isn't just about having a presentation. It's very much about instilling a discipline within the organization. And when you talk about it at that level, it really requires a lot of reinforcement. And so, we use this deck and the tenets of it to really help our onboarding process. We use it as a transformation tool within our teams, within the rituals. We incorporate lots of these pieces into our town halls, our skip level meetings. And we also have different task force initiatives that target certain aspects of these pieces. And so that's the way in which we really ensure that this isn't just, sort of a soundbite or just a moment in time, but that it's really something that's an ongoing process that we incorporate into the fabric of our engineering philosophy. So with that, I'm not going to go through every single one of these bullet items, but I'll highlight certain aspects of each one of these facets. So in ownership, really what we're getting at here is, accountability to start with, personal and team accountability. And I always feel it's important to start by looking in the mirror when you talk about accountability, and you think about the things that you personally can control, and then you work your way outwards. And that means with your team and thinking about your team's accountability and so on and so forth. And I think that, we're really all about trying to understand how to instill proper ownership habits within people. I think that when you think about, you know, a vision, you really want people to be able to not only own specific tasks, but you want to think about where are we going with this whole thing? What's the vision of our end game? And so that's a really important facet of what we want people to think about ahead of time before they jump in. And in the end, what that allows us to do is to have people really focus more on the outcomes and really own the outcomes and really respect that there's a life cycle involved to that outcome. Urgency is really, in my view, is very much about proactivity and prioritization. With proactivity, once again, kind of a common sense thing, but you know, we really want people to have a proactive attitude so that, you know, we're not cultivating folks who just want to sit around and wait to be told what to do. You know, that's not fun for anybody to do that for any period of time. And so proactivity is really key for us to make sure that folks are engaged and that they're really applying the right kind of urgency at the right time. Prioritization fits very well with that as well. It's a very important facet because you can be proactive about a lot of things, but if you don't have a sense of vision and prioritization, you could be doing things out of sequence, and you could be really, you know, being very inefficient when you want to be efficient. And this really gets into things like, you know, being ahead of things and really reducing fire drills and really having, you know, executing towards a plan instead of reacting to things. And then ultimately, it's also about honoring your commitments. You know, we feel very strongly about that. I mean, once again, a very common sense thing, but it's something that we feel that with urgency, those two things go really hand in hand. With transparency, you know, I think a big part of that is really respecting this concept of escalation. You know, even though I've talked a lot about sort of ownership and proactivity, you know, we don't expect people to be doing this by themselves. This is very much something where, you know, in order to build trust, you really need to recognize that, look, there's systems in place, there are multiple groups involved in many of the things that we do, and transparency is really critical so that you can escalate things when problems come up. You know, even with the best laid plans, there are always unknowns and unexpected events that occur, and it's more important to be responsive to those things instead of being worried that, oh, I didn't think about this, or, you know, we miscalculated something. That ultimately leads to building trust across organizations, which is, I think, is really, you know, really honestly the theme of this slide, but more importantly, that's how I think that gets executed in the best way. Valuing honest feedback is a really critical aspect of that. Another thing that's really easy to say, very hard to do at times, you know, it requires a certain amount of humility. And in our organization, that's something that has to go from top to bottom, all across the chain of command. There's nobody above that. And, you know, for this to be a really important facet of what we do, everybody has to be able to receive that feedback. In the end, that allows us to really learn and improve from our mistakes, obviously. And then really it breeds, I think, a culture where the transparency is there for us to be able to execute as opposed to be able to associate blame. And that's really what it's all about. Finally, with empowerment, you know, this is sort of the culmination of a lot of these other facets, because the idea is that, you know, empowerment really breeds very positive autonomy and ownership. You know, if you build trust, what happens is, you know, not only do people trust you, but you trust everybody else. And you know, this allows empowerment to really grow. And it allows organizations that may have been historically smaller and where, you know, a few people kind of, you know, exercise hero type behavior. It allows you to start growing more where you know, people become by themselves force multipliers because they feel empowered and they're given, you know, the ability to really run with things. And then as an organization, that trust grows and grows. And then in the end, that's really the hope in our organization for how we're going to reach greater efficiency and growth. So that's really the cultural trust slide. The next slide, excuse me, is our 4 Ps. And really what this is somewhat more of a physical breakdown of the way that these tenets get exercised within our organization. Once again, I'm not going to go through every point, but I'll try to, you know, kind of give you the narrative of these things. You know, people, process, platform, and products. So with people, you know, we're very much a team first attitude. I think, you know, there's not been a company that I've been associated with where teamwork wasn't at the center of all of our great successes. And that's no different at Acquia. Talent is really a premium here. You know, we get involved with a lot of different products and a lot of tech stacks, but in the end, we are very much a people business. And that is probably our #1 crucial limiting factor. we certainly value diversity along our people guidelines, and that stems into many different dimensions. We're very geographically diverse. Our company has historically had a pretty remote and distributed workforce, and that isn't changing. And we're still, recruiting and retaining talent all across the globe, and we expect to continue to do that. We also, really value diversity along the other lines, visually and socially, so that we really reflect the communities that we're in. We believe very strongly that, our perspectives are greatly enriched and our outreach to the outside world are greatly improved with the diversity that we have in-house. We also really strive to be diverse intellectually. We're not really interested in cloning a certain profile or certain demographic. I think it's really critical that, as we recruit people and nurture our talent, that we're really encouraging independent thinkers. And that by doing that, our greater collective will be stronger as a result. On process, I think continuous improvements are a really critical aspect of what we do. I think the replatforming that we're undergoing is probably one of the greater examples of that. But we're always looking at, our different processes and our different mechanisms to determine, what we can improve. And that also certainly stems to our technology stack as well. We do have a lot of proprietary tools and machinery in place today, as Acquia has been around for a while. And it's really important that we try to leverage those as best as we can. This is so that we can gain efficiencies across multiple groups and organizations. It also is a way for us to identify where we need to improve. So if we're leveraging our tools, it helps us, have references for, okay, maybe something's not working so well. And that's yet another entry point for us to insert improvement. Automation, it's a great buzzword, but it's really true. It's something that, as a company, full disclosure, we're certainly not automated at the level that any of us here would like. Especially because we've grown a lot through acquisitions. So we have a lot of systems that are kind of disparate. And it's a big initiative of ours to automate everywhere that we possibly can. Anywhere where there's certainly a redundant activity that could benefit from leveraging automation, we're doing that. And certainly areas where we're doing a lot of manual, procedures, we want to target those things and automate them as well. Lastly, on process, I think, we have made a pretty good investment on program management as well. And this is really a reflection of the idea that, in engineering, we don't want to take a myopic view of our deliverables and our processes. We really want to make sure that our reach is beyond that and really is benefiting the overall organization, business, and customers as a whole. And to do that, our program management arm is really brought in to really help us make sure that we do that we're really, leveraging interoperability as best we can. As far as platform goes, that's very near and dear to me personally, because that's, the area that I was brought in primarily to focus on. Platform in our case is really a way for us to really establish and leverage a very strong foundational platform from which we're really going to, benefit multiple teams. The goal here is to reduce unnecessary redundancy. It's also to allow us to optimize in areas of the system where we can become expert and then have everybody leverage those benefits. We do a lot of cool things. We research a lot of stuff. We get into a lot of new tech. We do a lot of proof of concepts. But in the end, we're all about delivery. We're in the delivery business, and so the platform is a really critical part of our delivery arm of engineering. And that's always going to be key to us. We really, ultimately, we have to be able to provide value to the customers. Otherwise, we've basically failed. This VFO concept is, just to highlight how important platform is to what we're doing today, is one of our vital few objectives. And so it's right in the heart of our 2020 goals and objectives. And it will be a huge enabler and unlock a lot of the capabilities and goals that we're going to have for 2021. Finally, on platform, I think balancing perfection and delivering, this is really just all about keeping the customer's value at the forefront of what we do. And in that case, we've got different knobs that we balance and optimize to make sure that, perfection isn't in the eye of the engineering teams. It's really in the eye of the customers. And sometimes that's balancing, scope with delivery times and technical excellence. All those things have to be kind of weighed properly for the right situation. On products, we've also made a lot of investment in our product side of the fence, product management, product ownership. And together with engineering, we have an R&D organization that's fairly unified, and that's really critical for our success. As I said before, in the end, we have to deliver to our, we have to deliver value to our customers, and we do that by being very closely tied with our product organization, so that we're really almost operate as a single organization. And this really ensures that we're factoring in all the right external stakeholder requirements married with the right internal stakeholder requirements. And this allows us to really balance, new features against tech debt, against quality initiatives, and so on and so forth, scalability and performance, goals. All those things have to be weighed together. And so having a very tightly integrated products and engineering organization is really critical to that. And then in the end, we're not interested in sacrificing quality. I mean, that's certainly something that with everything that we do, we want to make sure that all of our releases, all of our updates to our products are always improving the experience for our customers, not degrading them. Finally, my last slide is just a quick set of highlights that is really a bridge to my colleague Ed's discussion. And this is really to sort of get into some of the concepts of the replatforming, the microservices and technology elevation that we're here to talk about. As far as the highlights go, at a high level, the large monolith transformation is a big thing that we're undergoing with our microservices transformation. This involves definitely a centralized platform for our foundational services. Things like a centralized CI/CD. We have CI/CD in our environment. The problem is we have multiples, especially because of all of our acquisitions. And so the goal is to get to a centralized one that allows us to get maximum leverage and some consistency around the organization. Things like SSO, single sign-on, authentication, messaging. These are some of the areas that form that foundational set of services. Another key highlight is that we're transitioning from an EC2 compute model to a containers compute model that has many advantages as being an advanced technological technique, as well as being a very progressive business model for us going forward. In the end, with this idea of microservices, it really allows us to leverage our technical value and allows us to really identify key areas of reuse. It forms really tighter separation of concerns, which I think is really important for those of you who are really, who are familiar with microservices. It puts a significant emphasis on interfaces. It forms these contract layers so that, if you're providing a service to someone, the consumer is very clear on what they're getting. If you are a customer of a microservice, you know what you're getting. And those interfaces is really key to how the microservices interoperate with each other. This in turn really allows our agile teams to increase their velocity and autonomy. That's really critical in terms of these smaller teams being able to really run fast on their own. This also leads to or facilitates incremental development options. This allows us to add things and fold things in incrementally. It doesn't stop us from doing large changes to the product, but it just gives us many different ways to make those changes. In turn, this also facilitates faster technology changes and allows us to infuse things and not be so beholden to certain tech stacks or certain languages if we don't think that that's necessary, because it's more interface driven as opposed to technology driven. And then another great benefit, in my opinion, is it allows us to cultivate faster subject matter experts, because these smaller pieces makes it easier for people to learn parts of the system faster. It doesn't mean that there's not a value in understanding the larger systems, but at least it allows you to focus on certain areas and gain that expertise more quickly. So with that, I will hand it over to Ed as he will jump into the architecture specifics. Ed, you got that?
I do, yep. Just let me share my screen and I will get us moving. Okay, also I did see a comment in the chat room that I'll answer as well right off the bat, but first let me introduce myself. I'm Ed Brennan. I'm the Chief Software Architect here at Acquia. I came here about 1.5 years ago, and so the question that was in the chat was around, did the C-suite buy in to the culture of change in engineering? And were other organizations involved? And one of the primary reasons I was brought in was to actually drive some of that change. So they were bought in from the get-go, but I would say that that's a critical success factor when it comes to transforming an engineering organization and moving to microservices. So yes, they bought in. Other organizations were involved, like the product organization was involved. like the sales organization, like most other organizations, because moving to microservices unlocks a lot of potential for us. And I'll kind of get into some of that as we move through this. I just want to start off by talking about really what the journey looks like to microservices. Basically on the left-hand side, I've got a big box, which is our monolith there. In our case, we have multiple monoliths, but in this case, I'm just going to give you a small representation. We have a monolith that we have to try to figure out how to break into what I'm calling macroservices. And those are really just feature sets. What features do we have in these tools and these applications that we want to expose to our customers, and start decoupling them one at a time from the system. And then as you move forward into future phases, phase 2 through N, for example, you start getting into smaller and smaller services. But you can't do that in one big leap. You can't go from the monolith into the smaller microservices overnight. And so what we're doing for this journey is we're going into these larger macro services, and then we'll build smaller and smaller services as we go. But that's only to a certain point, right? At some point in time, there is no more business benefit from going any smaller and strangling the monolith any further. So you'll still have some of the monolith left at the end of this journey. But that monolith is left as a manageable size and manageable for an organization to be able to take care of. And so as we move through this, what a sample of a microservice breakout is, really is if you have an e-commerce app, for example, and that's going to have a user interface to it. But within the application itself, you're going to have users, you're going to have products, you're going to have inventory, you're going to have orders, and you're going to have a database. And that makes sense when your organization is a certain size. You only have a certain amount of team members working on it. But once you start getting larger and larger, it doesn't make sense anymore. Your organization can't scale. And so what you do is you break that out into the different feature sets that I was talking about earlier, the macro services. And so you're still going to have the same e-commerce user interface, and then that'll talk into an API, and then that'll talk into a messaging layer below. But then you'll have a team that's dedicated just to the users or authentication. And then you'll have a team that's dedicated to inventory, and a team that's dedicated to products and orders. And each one of those will have its own database and its own data stores. And it goes to this concept of do one thing and do it well. And so if you break out your teams in that way, it allows you to focus those teams on those specific things and make that service as robust and as available and performant as possible. So as we move through here, it's how do we get started? I mean, this is a very big project, right? This is not just an overnight thing. It's a cultural shift within an organization. And so within our organization, you have to really start with, what are all the features and functions our customers are consuming today? And as Kerry talked about earlier, we actually had 3 acquisitions in 2019. So not only did we have the current product set that was built up over 10 years of time, which had multiple monoliths in it, we had then acquisitions that occurred, and those are organizations that had some monoliths in it, and some of them had more advanced technologies because they're in early stages. And so at the end of the day, you have to take a look at what are all the features and functions you have across the organization your customers are looking to consume. And then you inventory your current technology stack. We had technologies that were in there from our legacy business, and that we had inventory technologies that are in there from our acquisitions. Many of those are overlapping, and some of those are not. And so now we have, as Kerry was talking about earlier, many CI/CD pipelines that we just acquired 3 more of. And so now you try to figure out what technology stacks do you want to carry forward. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So then you start identifying those first services to be broken out. Do you want every one of your applications to have an authentication mechanism or SSO in their own one of those, or reporting, for example? So we start looking at what those foundational services are going to be that are on that platform team. And we start looking at breaking those out. And then you start transitioning without constraints to the future state. And how you do that is use a messaging layer. That messaging layer allows you to share data between the monolith and the microservices and each microservice by itself without worrying about the data model that was constrained in the earlier phases or in the monoliths. So it allows you to start moving forward without the constraints because at the end of the day, you don't want to build what you had before just in smaller increments. What you want to do, you want to build something that is ready for the future, not for the past. And then you have to think through what the impacts to your organization are. This is not just about technology and breaking into the buzzword microservices. This is how does it impact your organization? What technologies are you going to consume? What technologies are you going to constrain? What technologies does your organization have expertise in today? And what's on the market for available resources you can get for those technologies? So you have to try to consider exactly how the technology and the architecture and the culture and the organization kind of go together and move forward as one cohesive unit. So how do we apply this to Acquia? So what we basically first did is we took a look at what we're selling to our customers. And we have the DXP platform that we're selling to our customers. That DXP platform really is talking about a unified user experience across all of our product set. And we sell campaigns to customers, and we sell customer data platforms, and we sell sites and their hosting, and we sell low-code, no-code way of building those sites. And we have other ancillary services that we have as well. And then we have an orchestration and learning and machine learning infrastructure that sits below that. But at the real core is the content and the data. So what I try to do is I try to match that to what we're trying to do on the back end. So for example, we're moving to containers and microservices and using Kubernetes to do that orchestration of those containers. Then we're moving to clustered databases, but do I really want to manage my own databases, or do I want to use some sort of a managed service like an Aurora DB, for example? And we want to install that messaging layer, which then moves us from really a point-to-point communication or system communication to more of a publish once, consume many type or event-based architecture. We want to use an elastic file system that allows our customers to grow as their business grows. And then, as Gary was mentioning earlier as well, we want to automate it all because at the end of the day, I don't get value from my customers by doing things manually. I get it by automating so I can focus on their feature sets. Then the other side, I think about all the operational pieces that go hand in hand with that. So what are our SLAs? What are we trying to deliver to our customers? What are the point of demarcations for those? How do I integrate with our support organization and give them the tools they need to actually deliver that value to our customers? What about backups and snapshots of their file systems and databases? And then monitoring. How do we monitor and what do we monitor? It's a different world moving from pets over to cattle. So now I'm not worried about EC2 nodes and CPU utilization as much as I was before because I've got Kubernetes is going to orchestrate a lot of that for me. I worry about a cluster and that cluster, the size of that cluster, and whether I have nodes to grow into or not, and whether I'm maxing out the size of it. So it's more about business logic around when do I provision a new cluster and how do I provision that new cluster. And then I took a look at what we have. We have a bunch of monoliths, right? All software starts out simple, right? It's a simple idea. I want to create users. I want to create Drupal sites. I want to have a database and a file system that belong to it. That's simple. But when I start getting to the point where I've got thousands of EC2 nodes and I've got tens of thousands of sites running, it's no longer simple. And so now that's where we start to see all these monoliths and start having these scale issues. So we have to take a look at all the monoliths we have today and the complexity we've built in and how do I simplify that? Everybody builds with the best intentions, but those intentions change over time and the requirements change over time. And we've gone back and looked at why we built what we built and does it still match to our future requirements for our customers? And then timeline and pressure forces a lot of shortcuts. And I'm sure you all can relate to that, right? It's easier to do this and we'll do it just for now, but we'll go back and get it later on. And that's always it's never a good answer. We need to take the time to be able to deliver what's right for the customer and what the customer is looking for and what we need to deliver as a company. So you try to have that balance between time pressures and shortcuts that you're instilling in your infrastructure. And then acquisitions that make it even much more complex than that because now you have a well-known infrastructure that you've been running for a while, and now you're trying to layer in new pieces to that. Our marketing acquisition or our CDP acquisition. Those are our marketing acquisition, for example, is another open source tool. So now, how do we keep the open source world still going while still supporting it within our infrastructure and consolidating those technologies? And the same thing goes for Drupal being open source. So we're an open source company. So we try to do what's best for both our organization and the open source community to move them both forward successfully. And so what are the themes to microservices? And really what it boils down to is some basics. They're a loosely coupled, tightly integrated service. When I say loosely coupled, each team can move forward independently. They can create their own UIs or databases, make technology decisions within constraints, but move forward independently, but ensure that communication between their service and others goes forward. It's those contracts that Carrie was talking about earlier. It's an event-based architecture. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, but everything that happens in an environment is an event, or an application, I should say, an event in the system. A user logs in, it's an event in the system. And maybe my authentication is synchronous, so I'll have API calls for that. But maybe that also publishes an event to the messaging bus where I've got CCIs that tell me about my entitlements for that customer. What do they have access to and why? And then how do I create the dashboard they're looking for? What is their profile that they have access to? So it's an event-based architecture. Independently deployed and tested. So each team can move forward independently, as I talked about earlier, and deploy and test on their own. So we want to automate that pipeline for everything. So that an engineer just focuses on what am I developing that is going to deliver value to the customer so I can move that forward independently. And then with an ephemeral world, which are containers, you then want to monitor and log everything. If you do not monitor and log everything, all of a sudden your logs disappear because those containers disappear. So all your containers are being cycled out in real time as your customers need more resources or less resources. Or as we see a hotspot in the environment, Kubernetes is going to remap it and add nodes. So those logs go away because those containers go away. So you have to send everything to a centralized logging infrastructure. And then you want to make sure you have synchronous and asynchronous communication, both API calls, point-to-point, and events in a messaging bus so that you can manage communication protocols based upon the requirements of the features in the application stacks. So, what we looked at and what was required was really a new approach. And as I talk about that event-based system, you start breaking out those services. We want to take a look at what those foundational services are. For example, on the back end, Kerry's team will run. We want Kubernetes as a service. We don't want each individual team to have a Kubernetes cluster that they manage. We want to have Kubernetes as a service that they can consume. Monitoring and logging is something that an engineering organization would consume from that platform as a service. So they don't have to take into account how they're going to do it, what tools they're going to use. They just start sending those logs into the system, deploying the Fluent bits and the Fluent Ds in the infrastructure. And then they have that messaging bus that we were talking about. That's centrally managed as well. So now that's on a platform services team so that the individual teams just focus on customer value, authentication and business intelligence and data layers. And then the other thing is we are FedRAMP's authorized shop. So that means now if we build this platform correctly, 80% of the FedRAMP compliance is consumable by our engineers instead of them having to focus on getting FedRAMP authorization just for themselves. So that's something that they can consume in this kind of a model. And then DevOps and SecOps, so that we have DevOps automation and security operations all built into the system so that each team can move forward knowing that their code is secure and their infrastructure is secure. And then site orchestration, so that that site orchestration capability can be consumed across all of our customers, not just specific ones. And that all that communication is handled through the messaging system. But then on the top of that, you're going to have your consumable APIs from your customers. And those need to be broken out, but also secure to consume, much like they were a unified offering. So much like we want to have a unified user experience from the UI perspective, we want to have that same experience from the API perspective. So that when they're interacting with it programmatically, they know how to do that, and they know that they think they will use the same tools, the same applications with the same company, all supported by centralized authentication and centralized sign-on. And then that needs to be published through some sort of an API gateway. And that gateway, then we'll have all the SDKs and API documentation required for the customers to be able to consume it. And then on the outside of that, you have your different UIs, but those UIs are now under a consolidated framework. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, because we talked about, do we really need 7 different UI frameworks? And do we all need to have our own repos when we're building them? Or do we move towards more of a, we'll have two frameworks that we want to support going forward, like Angular and React. And then when we do that, do we want to have some sort of a mono repo type technology that we want to leverage so that all teams can independently move forward, but still share in their common libraries and common testing frameworks and automation and tooling. And so we moved towards a mono repo type capability and selected two different UI frameworks instead of the 7 that we had. So now we're just simplifying our architecture significantly. And talk about some sample event-based architecture type platform. What we have here is just a simple platform and all the different services that are part of that. You have identity or payments or entitlements, hosting or cloud itself, the hosting platform. And so all of those services now are able to communicate with one another. And that communication, you need to formalize that communication up front, establish those contracts as Gary was talking about. What do those messages look like? How are they going to be sent? Who can consume them? And you have your publishers and consumers on either side, and you're able to have your topics that each one of them can be able to publish and consume from. And then you can dynamically create topics as you move forward, as new things come up. So now you have the ability to have a publish once but use many. A person logs in, it sparks off a set of events that happen in the system by other services that need to consume that and act upon that. Some of those will be synchronous communications through API calls. Others will be through a messaging bus platform in the back end. So that's kind of how I think about the event-based architecture. And so then we have to think about what are the impacts in the organization and how do I organize around this? Kerry and I partner very closely on these things because every decision I make on the architecture side has an impact on the organization. And so we try to think about how do we want to organize our teams. And so in our case, we decided to have these 3 big buckets of teams, and each one of them will have different teams within them and services within those. So we took a look at, and we have our Drupal Cloud platform where we have our things like Site Factory and Site Studio and Content Hub and Acquia Cloud platform itself. And then on the marketing side, which where a lot of our acquisitions came from, is our Campaign Studio and our personalization. But what we want is we want our customers to be able to consume those as a single entity. So don't think about these as products or separations of products, but more of an organizational structure that helps you move forward with your microservices and help your teams focus on those specific areas. And then you have Kerry's team on the bottom there, where he focuses on all those shared pieces across those different teams. So our architectural decisions need to inform the org structure and vice versa. We broke our organization into logical groupings of teams based upon the features that they were building on. Then we create a phased approach for that execution. We can't just change everything overnight. And these teams have been used to focusing on the monolith. How do I focus on just the services going forward? So it's a phased execution plan that we're working on. And then institute a change management program because there's a lot of change going on. And that was one of the first questions asked in the chat, right? Did the executives buy into the change? It's not just about the executives, although that is one of the more important set of people to actually buy into the change. Your organization, your culture needs to buy into that change. So institute a change management program so you can actually institute that change in some sort of a programmatic way and some sort of a consumable way from the teams. And then how does that break down into a lot of the technologies that we've looked at and chosen here, right? And so if you look at it, we're centralizing on Jenkins. Most teams use Jenkins today. So let's centralize that Jenkins team and have Kerry's team run that. And then have Veracode so that Veracode is something that all the teams are consuming and scanning their software as it goes through. And then everybody has Docker images. Those Docker images are what gets deployed into these environments, instantiated. And then how do I instantiate those and automate those in the environment? So do I look at something like an Argo that is specifically designed for Kubernetes when I have a legacy environment too? So I have to have Argo for Kubernetes, but I have to have something like a harness for the rest of the environments because we're still have other environments day one, right? So we'll have those environments around for some time, so we've got to support both. And then we want to have some sort of a feature flag capability so the teams can move forward faster than the product team wants to advertise features coming in the environment. So now you have the ability to turn on and off features based upon the product's release cycle, not our engineering release cycle. They don't have to match. And then you have to have some way of managing these clusters, because at the end of the day, our company will have about 150 clusters spread across 9 regions. And to be able to manage and automate those things took another tool called Bonsai Cloud that allows us to actually manage and consistently deploy EKS clusters in those regions and make sure that those EKS clusters can scale up and down based upon the needs of the customers. And on the other side, you have your release cycles, right? Your Canary, you have your internal, and you have your production infrastructures. And each one of those will have its technologies, but they're going to be consistent. So you're going to have Helm charts, you're going to have Kubernetes nodes, and you're going to have EKS backplane, control plane, so you can actually manage the infrastructures through the EKS service. And then all of those are going to have images. Those images need to be scanned. They need to be secured. So you're going to need something that allows you to do that. You're going to have Qualys, for example, on the right-hand side there. And you're going to have code scanning needs for your customers because they're bringing code to the table. So you have things like Argo, Anchor, and Falco that allows you to do those types of things in real time. And what we had to do is we had to build our own microservices around Kubernetes. What that means is our customers need workloads deployed to these Kubernetes containers. And that needed some sort of a controller that allows you to be able to deploy those in an automated way. And at runtime, actually inject their code. So we have microservices that are around environment stand-up. So what does a CRD look like for a customer? How many containers do they have? How many pods do they have? How do they attach to the backend databases? How do they attach to the file system? What file systems do they have? And then you have our controllers that actually manage the runtime environments. When does the customer code get injected? When do you stand them up? And then we have a constant way of looking at those CRDs to ensure that the runtime environment matches those CRDs. And when they don't, we instantiate the changes required to make those things more aligned to those CRDs. So those are the kind of microservices we had to build to make this service available for our customers. And then you have to figure out what languages you want to use. Do you want to use Go? Do you want to use Python? Do you want to use Terraform? But do I really need Ruby? Do I really need other languages we had in this environment? And the answer is maybe sometimes. But we want to try to consolidate as much as possible onto a limited set of languages. And as new needs come up, we all sit there and we try to figure out why and how do we move forward and what languages we want to use. And I think that's the end of the presentation for me, Bonnie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you, Carrie. As we can go ahead and move into the discussion portion now, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or just anything that you'd like to discuss. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question, and we can go ahead and get started.
Last time we had about 3 minutes of silence before the questions started rolling in, so we all played finger puppets. Maybe we do something different this time.
Well, I'll start then. I'm not bashful. Hi, Ed. Hi, Carrie. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Steve Helzel. So my question is, first of all, it's great to see what you guys are doing. Guys meaning I meant the whole company. And your transformation is spectacular. The question now I have is a little more technical, which is, you talked a little bit about containers coming and going away, and what do you do with storage? Are you using persistent storage via Kubernetes and CSI interface to cover those things? What's your approach?
Yeah, we are. So there's a couple of components there. We are using the CSI driver and PVCs to actually instantiate the persistent storage on the back end. But at the same time on EFS, they have things called access points. And that allows us to multi-tenant EFS as well. And on the other side, they don't have a CSI driver, although I've asked for it. They don't have a CSI driver for Aurora. So what we have done is we have to instantiate Aurora clusters ourselves for a data service. We built another microservice that's around the data service. And so that data service instantiates the cluster, and then Kubernetes can consume that cluster. And so they'll have shared keys that we give it, so they have access to that cluster to create a schema for those new environments that are being spun up.
Okay, yeah, great. We're just getting into this this stage now, so we're trying to figure out our best method. We're mostly a file-based company, So we're, connecting through NFS right now, but we don't think that's going to meet the long-term needs.
Yeah, EFS is a good solution for this. And again, the CSI driver and VPCs and classes of storage within Kubernetes actually works very well.
Okay. I've got more questions. They're all over the map. I'll keep going unless somebody else raises their hand. So, test automation. Can you talk more about your strategy and your approach and the platform that you're using?
Yeah, so funny enough, we just hired a QE guy, a head of QE, and I'm waiting for him to give me his strategy and talk through his strategy. So I don't have that strategy for you because we have not consolidated on that yet. So a future tech talk, we'll talk through our QE automation as we move there, because we have multiple tools today and we're trying to consolidate that as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
Sure.
oh, sorry. What I was going to just add, obviously we do leverage, our CI/CD, and part of the value of the centralized CI/CD is that, we do have, a decent amount of, unit test infrastructure and code coverage. But yeah, in terms of a larger integrated system for QE, that's still very much in the works.
Okay. Well, I'll put an offer out there. If you are interested in just a discussion, I can certainly have discussion. One of the things I do I run my infrastructure platform services, and we've rolled out a test automation framework. And the way we've coined our pipeline is we don't say CI/CD, we say CI/CT, CD, and CM for the continuous monitoring. And I'm about to receive a patent on test automation framework for our work here. So happy to have an open discussion and dialogue anytime.
You're missing one, which is CO, which is continuous operations.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's where I need some buy-in from the C-suite.
So there's one more question. Just let me interrupt you for a second. See if we got another question here, which is when you started the microservices journey, did the monolith and the newly created macroservices run in the same data center or cloud? So everything's in a cloud today. We're all in AWS today. I shouldn't say that. We had those acquisitions, and those acquisitions actually run in Google as well. So we have two cloud strategies today. Now, to answer that question specifically, I'm trying to consolidate. They're going to run the same cloud, but not necessarily the same VPC. We have a lot of VPCs today. I don't want to tell you the number, but there's a lot of them. And so as you can imagine, as you move forward, there are reasons that customers actually purchase their own VPC, and they'll still be able to do so, and they'll get their own cluster. But we no longer have to worry about splitting infrastructures out across compliances. So I don't have to have a VPC that's for HIPAA or FedRAMP, for example. They can all be in the same place in the same VPC and just in multiple clusters. So it allows me a little bit more flexibility as I'm deploying this. So we are looking at a consolidation strategy as we move that out. So yes, the same cloud, but not the same VPCs necessarily. And then, Carrie, you might want to address this, or I can, but Karen had a question about what methodology or processes were you using to do that program management.
Yeah, I mean, it's still very much a work in progress because we've just kind of made a pretty big investment in not only program management, but also product management resources. At a loose level, a very simple level, the building block level, we're using Agile, Scrum, and we've got a lot of the rituals that you use for that kind of planning. But we really are actually spending a lot of time right now rethinking the way that we're doing planning, because we've got this this balancing act between, kind of what you would consider pure Agile and really the ability to sort of be more predictable at the release level, sort of this, sort of that train mentality of, of release track. And so we're really, I don't know that I could come up with one concept right now that I would call it. We're sort of adapting it right now, but it's sort of it's going to be a hybrid between, deliverables that we get on a very sort of tight Agile sprint cadence, and then rolling those things up into more of a train methodology for discrete releases so that we can plan those things accordingly with our customer base. Because we definitely, as we do these rollouts with our microservices architecture, we are electing to take, different cohorts of our customers and bring them along, sort of a cohort by cohort basis. So that's sort of, the best way. I don't know, Ed, if you have anything else to shed light on that, but that's kind of my slide.
we just brought in a lead for Agile for program management as well, and she's really taking ownership of that and getting things under control. But we are using the Agile methodology for program management overall and development management. So we are an Agile shop. We are looking at coaches coming in as well to help more education going on. But that's kind of what we're doing today, and Alexis will continue to enhance that as she moves forward. And then there's another question there from Rob asking about, what messaging bus we're using from a technology perspective. And to be quite honest with you, we just changed. We started with ActiveMQ. AWS's ActiveMQ was a managed service. And to be honest with you, it didn't meet our needs. It wasn't from a latency perspective. It was from a dynamic change perspective. You couldn't dynamically add users. You couldn't dynamically make configuration changes without actually rebooting the system, which is, as you know, a problem when it comes to an enterprise messaging bus. And so we actually are moving over to SNS SQS now. And that is, I think it's going to be a good service. We've had a lot of luck with it thus far, which depends on whether you're doing messaging within the region or out of region. You have different latencies based upon that. And so within region, I think we're fine. We're sub 10 millisecond response time to latency. I'm not worried about that. It's outside of region that bothers me a little bit. You're starting to see 70, 80 millisecond response times, and you don't want to see that in the system. But it's going to be fine for our needs right now. I think ultimately we're going to move towards Kafka, to be quite honest with you. I think that's where we're going to land, because that's going to be, it also gives you Kafka stream, so you have a little bit more flexibility on the latency there. So I believe that Kafka is going to be our end state when we get there.
Yeah, and let me just highlight one other aspect of that, which I think is key here in terms of execution, which is that, we don't know yet how much mileage we'll get out of SNS SQS. It's quite possible that we could get a decent amount of mileage out of it. But we're going to have to monitor that, and we're going to have to be adaptable based on what we find in our own testing and our own scale out as we migrate more and more customers over. One of the key parts of that, especially in a microservice environment, is to really do our best to maintain interface level relationships with our technologies. Now, this is going to be a little bit tricky for those who are familiar with Kafka versus SQS SNS. The semantics are not exactly the same, and so there's a decision that we'll have to make as to how generalized you want to make these interfaces, and do you do that work up front or do you do it later? How long are we going to have with SQS and SNS versus when do we want to go to something like Kafka? But these are the kinds of things that make a lot of the tenets that we talked about in the culture side of things really important, so that we can be adaptable, so that we can really focus on the right things at the right time. So that's what my only point is, that it might be Kafka, but it could be a while before we need it. So we need to be adaptable in that respect.
Well, not only that, is I've been open-minded to SNS SQS being our long-term solution. Let's find out, right? So I know it's going to meet our short-term goals, and if it surprises me and it doesn't have the latency I was expecting it to have, then great, we'll keep it. We won't make any change. But if we do, then we have a backup plan for what we want to move to.
Cool. Hey, thanks so much, by the way. I'm dealing with a lot of these issues, have been for some time. So very interested to, see how things develop there.
Absolutely. This recording will be sent out. We have an email alias you can email us questions on. We can all collaborate, because I think we're all going through these changes, to be quite honest with you. And I'd rather go through them together than go through them individually, because these changes are similar across organizations. There's another question there too, with respect to the consolidation of automation. There's a need to move a lot of the tools. You're absolutely right. So there's a lot of need to move legacy test scripts and things like that into a consolidated way. And so there is no way to do that easily. We planned for it, is what we basically did. Is we knew we wanted to make this change. We knew we wanted to make this transformation. And so we're investing in those things to be able to make that happen. Now, one of the things we are doing to make that a little bit less cost heavy is we have a lot of resources being spun up in India right now. So that's where one of our COEs is in India. So we're adding resources, and we'll start with freshers. Allow them, that's one of the best ways to get them to understand their products, is to be able to rewrite some of these tests and actually be able to get to learn our products. So that's kind of how we're looking at doing it. Don't know if that fully answers your questions. I don't think there's any silver bullet to it, but you have to invest the time and the money to make that happen.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that this is very much a prioritization proposition, what you're asking, because one of the tricks, although I think it's one of the reasons why a microservices approach is very compelling, is that most companies like ours, like those of you out there, you don't have the luxury of just turning everything off and then building something new and then letting the customers use a new thing, right? You've got to keep things moving on the legacy. In fact, you've got to probably keep enhancing the legacy until you're ready to make that shift. So you're kind of living two lives at the same time. And so for us, what's nice about the microservices approach is it allows us to be additive to the new stuff without necessarily infringing on the legacy. But what it does bring up is a debate as to, how much investment do you give to the legacy while you're trying to move ahead with the future state. And there's no one answer, and it requires a very much a case-by-case analysis to try to figure out, the business impact, what the cost is, what the impact is to your resources. It's an ongoing thing that, it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. We really kind of have to monitor these things all the time because things flare up. You got most of our, all of our customer base for the most part is on the legacy now. And so we can't predict certain needs that will come up that may impair our ability to completely focus on the future state. And so it's not a crisp answer, but that's really kind of the way that's the thought process that we use in trying to deliberate those things.
Yeah, and just to to end on that, what we also did is we basically take a certain percentage of a sprint and we say that is dedicated towards technical debt, and part of that is technical debt, being able to move those different scripts and those different test cases over. Move on to the next question, and for the Kubernetes clusters, orchestration on different cloud environments and monitoring, is there a plan to use tools like Rancher or Cloudify or similar tools? The answer is yes, there is a plan to use similar tools. We're not going to use Rancher. So part of the slide deck, and you heard me talk about earlier, is we selected a tool called Bonsai Cloud. Bonsai Cloud allows you to use it across the different clouds. You don't have to worry about just being EKS or in GCP, for example. And they actually have their own cloud. So there's multiple ways to do it with them. We picked them because they were probably the most mature tool we saw out there for all of this stuff. And then what are some of the processes and technical challenges you faced in the transformation work? I will tell you the technical challenges are probably the least of my challenges. And the cultural changes were probably the most. I'm seeing a smile, so it's not unheard of, right? Changing a culture that is embedded in API to API communication protocols and modelless to a microservices type technology is difficult. But some of the technical challenges we did face were, we heard a lot of things around, it's never going to work in containers, it's not going to work with the EFS, it's too slow, and all these other things, right? So we had to build out prototypes. So my architecture team and myself, went off to the side and just built a prototype. Here it is working. Here's Kubernetes. Here's Drupal. Here's EFS. Here's Aurora. And then some of the other challenges you face is every time you work with a managed service, for example, from any cloud company, Aurora or EFS or whatever else, you come across limitations. We're an extremely large shop. We have thousands upon thousands of nodes in the infrastructure and tens of thousands of sites running. And so IP addresses become a problem. And can I get all of the information out of the Aurora endpoint that I really needed because I have to have a schema-based architecture, not a cluster-based architecture? From EFS, can I pull all the information I'm looking for? When do I add a new cluster to that infrastructure? So those are some of the technical challenges I face still on a daily basis. When you go into this, do we want to use Qualys or do we want to use something like Anchor that's more container-based? And so we look at all of the different changes we have to impact on the organization and all the technologies to work with. And there's so many out there. I mean, they're arriving on a daily basis. Customers are used to SSHing in, for example. How do I give them SSH access into an ephemeral container that goes away? And so we've designed solutions for those problems. So those are some of the technical challenges we face on a daily basis. As I said, though, I don't think the technical challenges are the big brunt of the work.
No, I mean, I can just tell you, I'll just use a really simple example. Imagine that, you got different teams, as I said, from acquisition, and you got folks who are building all their CI/CD on Travis CI, and other folks are doing it in Jenkins, and that see's like not a big deal, but guess what? It can be a big deal. And we've got that kind of dilemma on multiple levels. It's not just CI/CD, because, with the microservices architecture, there's almost like an irony here, which is that on some level, it breeds a lot of really good and positive autonomy, but it also does require certain aspects of standardization in order for the platform aspect to be successful. And so you've got both. You've got both things going on. You got this dynamic, and that's why the cultural part's really important, because in the end, it's folks in leadership that have to figure out how to bridge that gap and have to, some of it's negotiation, some of it's, guidance, I guess would be the way to put it. And in the end, we need everybody to buy into the things that we standardize because of the value and the acceleration and velocity gains that we're going to get. So that the hope is that we're handing over a better tomorrow for our team so they can focus on the parts that they really want to focus on. I mean, does everybody, do you need 10 teams to be solving their own CI/CD problems? I mean, that doesn't seem very interesting to me, at least for what our business is. And so that's the proposition. That is some of the process and cultural challenges that we face in this kind of a transformation.
I am going to have to jump in now because we are right at time. Thank you so much, everybody that attended today, and thank you, Ed and Carrie, for a great presentation. We will be sharing these presentations with all of you, and if you think of a question that you didn't get to ask, you can email it to acquiatechtalk@acquia.com, and we will get back to you. Once again, thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your evening.
All right, guys, thanks.
Everybody.
See you later.
Take care.